Who doesn't love a story? Stories are so important. They help us understand the world and they help us understand ourselves. We all have our own stories, don't we, that tell who we are. The people and events that make up our lives shape our identity. I remember that for many years after we moved to Cowes, when people asked where I was from, I would say, well, I live in Cowes, but I come from Bryston. Somehow I didn't feel that living in Cowes explained exactly who I was. A couple of years ago, my cousin organised a family reunion for all the descendants of our great-grandparents. It was a great time reconnecting and sharing memories and meeting new people and seeing new photos. Although she died before I was born, I grew up surrounded by stories of my great-grandmother. She brought up my mum when my mum's mum had died, and she was the most formative person in my mum's life. And in a way, that came through into influencing my life. What I found most incredible that day of the reunion was when my mum's cousin shared his memory of Gran. The stories he told were different than my mum's, his own experiences, of course. And like my mum's, they contained tragedies, his own loss of his father. But amidst his own stories, there was the same Gran my mum spoke of. And what blew me away was to hear him describe what I knew to be true from my mum, that Gran had been the rock for all of them, and was why they were the people they were today. For this family, in all their stories, in some really terrible and painful events and tragedies, there was this rock who redeemed the tragedies with her devoted but firm care. It might not surprise you to hear that Gran was a devout Christian who walked her talk, lived out her faith, and her actions and example had become the identity for her family for generations now. Well, we've been looking at Matthew's Gospel recently, and of course Matthew begins with a family history, with the family tree of Jesus. You might like to find it in your Bible, there in chapter 1 of Matthew, if you have a Bible to hand. Matthew is wanting us to see that Jesus is descended from Abraham, the father of the people of Israel, and from the line of King David. He wants us to understand that Jesus is the promised Messiah, the awaited King. Genealogies may not make the most riveting reading, but what is fascinating is that each name is another story, and what these stories represent. You know, when we look back at our family history, we don't always find lovely stories. Sometimes there are some real skeletons in the cupboard. And this is true for Jesus. Here are the names of liars and cheats, adulterers and murderers. There are faults and failings aplenty. Even the supposed heroes, Abraham and David, were deeply flawed. What an embarrassing episode of Who Do You Think You Are this would make. What a sorry story if it wasn't also the story of God. If this history of a people who constantly get it wrong wasn't also the story of a God who rescues them, who gives them chance after chance, who calls them back time after time. God rescues his people out of Egypt and takes them on a journey towards the land and a nation he has promised. This is the story told and retold throughout the Bible, the story that gives the people their identity, that tells them who they are. They are his people, and he is their deliverer. The faults and failings of his people did not define them. God's love for them defined them. He chose them. He loved them. He redeemed them. And of course, Jesus is part of this redemption. For Jesus has two sides to his family tree, the human and the divine. Jesus is deeply human, but he is also God, and in himself is able to redeem humanity. Jesus is the perfect human, the true human. He is the rock, the example of what we are created to be, living as God intends us to. Jesus is not flawed or broken, but he allows himself to be broken, to redeem humanity, to rescue humanity once and for all. And his story becomes our story. For we who put our faith in him are grafted into Jesus' family tree. Through Jesus, we are adopted in. We are children of God, his people. Their story, his story, is our story. God's promises to his people are being fulfilled in us. God told the people of Israel, although the whole earth is mine, you will be for me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. And through the Apostle Peter, he tells us, the followers of Jesus, the same, that we are now that holy and priestly kingdom. What can we learn from this? I think we can learn that our stories, our lives, our identities can be redeemed, because our stories are mixed too. They do not always shape us in helpful ways. The hurts and tragedies, the learned behaviour from our families can be carried with us. Sometimes the stories we allow to shape our identities have told us lies, that we are worthless, that we are unlovable. And in turn, these shape our lives, how we behave, what decisions we make, how we treat other people. I wonder, what is your identity? What stories shape you? Are you defined by faults and failings, or are you defined by God's story, God's truth, that you're created in his image, deeply loved by him, precious to him, so precious that Jesus gave himself to redeem you? If not, perhaps it's time to write a new chapter, to discover the God who loves you and step into a new story. I think those of us who are followers of Jesus must be challenged to think about the stories we are writing with our lives. I wonder, what stories will people tell of us? Is the story of God's rescuing love evident in our daily lives, in how we care for people, in the choices we make? How are we touching others? How are we inspiring them? As our history is being written in our lives, I pray that it may be founded on him, the redeeming rock that is our God. And I pray that our history and our lives may be run through with his love and grace, and that standing firm on him, our lives may become places of welcome, healing and wholeness for others. Let's reflect now on how our lives can be that, as we listen to a beautiful song based on the words of St. Teresa of Avila, Christ has no body but yours.